49 years ago, an entire school vanished without a trace during a routine field trip. 73 students and 8 staff members from Westbrook Academy in Pinehaven disappeared into thin air, leaving families devastated and authorities baffled. Despite the largest search operation in the state's history, no bodies were found, no evidence surfaced, and as years passed, the case went cold. Yet through all these decades, Linda Graham, whose 12-year-old daughter Sophie was among the missing, never stopped searching for answers, even as her persistence cost her nearly everything. Then one day, while sorting through her recently deceased husband's belongings, Linda discovered an overlooked detail in an old photograph that changed everything about the case. Linda's investigation revealed the horrifying truth. The students hadn't simply vanished, they had been victims of something far more sinister, a cover-up designed to hide an environmental disaster that had claimed lives and forced survivors into hiding with new identities. While their families were told no one survived, Linda's discovery would finally reveal the shocking fate of her beloved daughter and bring powerful men to justice. After nearly 5 decades of lies. Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The morning sun cast long shadows across Linda Graham's bedroom as she slowly opened her eyes to face another day. The calendar on her nightstand showed the date circled in red: May 17th, 2025. 49 years since Sophie disappeared. Linda's joints hatched as she sat up, her once auburn hair now completely silver, falling loosely around her shoulders. At 73, she moved more slowly than she once did, but her mind remained sharp as ever. She reached for the framed photograph beside her bed. Sophie in her Westbrook Academy uniform, smiling brightly on her first day of 7th grade. Her fingers traced the outline of her daughter's face, a ritual performed countless times over the decades. Another year without answers, she whispered, "But I won't give up, not ever." Bailey, her aging golden retriever, nudged her hand, sensing her distress. Linda patted the dog's head, grateful for the companionship since Martin's passing 3 months ago. The house felt emptier without him, though their relationship had grown strained over the years, largely due to her refusal to let go of the past. "Come on, girl," Linda said softly. "Let's get some breakfast in the kitchen." Linda moved methodically, preparing coffee and toast, while the morning news played softly from the small television on the counter. She barely registered the anchor's words until Sophie's name caught her attention. Today marks 49 years since the Westbrook Academy tragedy, when 73 students and 8 staff members vanished during a school field trip. The case remains one of the most mysterious disappearances in state history. Linda turned up the volume, listening intently as they rehashed the familiar details. The news segment showed grainy footage from 1976 search parties, combing through dense woodland, helicopters sweeping the area, and tearful parents pleading for information. She caught a glimpse of her younger self standing alongside Martin, eyes hollow with shock. The doorbell interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see Irene Carter standing on her porch, holding a casserole dish. Linda took a deep breath before opening the door. "Morning, Linda," Irene said softly. "I thought you might not feel like cooking today." Linda managed a small smile. "Thank you. Come in." Irene had lost her son David in the same incident, but unlike Linda, she had eventually accepted the official explanation that the bus had likely crashed in a remote area impossible to locate. Most families had held memorial services years ago. Linda had refused. "I made your favorite," Irene said, setting the dish on the counter. "Martin always said my chicken sorrel could solve world peace." Linda's throat tightened at the mention of her husband. "He did love your cooking." Irene studied her friend's face. "How are you holding up with Martin gone? I'd worry about you being alone, especially today." "I'm managing," Linda replied, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Actually, I've been going through Martin's things. It's harder than I expected. Do you want some?" Green had remained steadfast, though even she didn't understand Linda's obsession with finding the truth. "That would be nice," Linda conceded. "I started with his office yesterday. There's so much paperwork." Martin never threw anything away. They moved to Martin's home office, a room Linda had barely entered since his death. Cardboard boxes sat half filled on the floor, the desk still cluttered with decades of accumulated documents. He kept everything related to the investigation, Linda explained, gesturing to several filing cabinets. Every newspaper clipping, every police report. We managed to get every theory anyone ever suggested. He supported you in his own way, Irene said gently. Linda nodded, remembering the arguments, the late nights when Martin begged her to let go to focus on the life they still had. He never understood that without knowing what happened to Sophie, she couldn't move forward. This box is ready to be donated, Linda said, changing the subject, mostly old clothes and books, as they worked in companionable silence, sorting through decades of memories. Linda came across a shoebox tucked at the back of Martin's closet. Inside were photographs she'd never seen before, pictures from the last school event, before the disappearance, the spring science fair at Westbrook Academy. I don't remember these, Linda murmured, spreading the photos across the desk. Irene leaned closer. Martin must have taken them. Look, there's David by his volcano project. Her finger trembled slightly as she pointed to her son. Linda's heart raced as she examined each photo carefully. There was Sophie standing proudly next to her display on native plant species. Several showed the children with their teachers, and a few captured Principal Morris addressing the parents. I didn't know Martin took so many pictures that day, Linda said, confusion evident in her voice. Then she saw a photograph taken outside the school, showing the yellow school bus that would carry the children away just 2 days later. The bus that would never return. Something caught her eye in the background, partially obscured, but unmistakable. Irene, Linda whispered, her hand shaking. Look at this. The photo showed several people standing near the bus. In the background was a man in a dark suit talking to Principal Morris. The lighting was poor, but the man's profile was visible. That's Bernard Wallace, Linda said, her voice rising with excitement and disbelief. Irene squinted. The industrialist. I can't tell from this angle. It's him, Linda insisted. Wallace Industries owned the land where the children were headed for their nature study. The official story was that he never had any connection to the school. Irene frowned. Linda, please, not today. Even if it is Wallace, he probably just donated money to the school. He funded half the county back then. But Linda wasn't listening. She was already pulling out her old research files, connecting dots that had eluded her for decades. The official report stated that Wallace Industries had no relationship with Westbrook Academy. This photo proves otherwise. Linda's eyes shone with a determination Irene hadn't seen in years. And look at Morris's face. He looks worried, not like someone having a friendly conversation with a donor. Linda, you can't possibly. I need to speak with Mrs. Morris, Linda said, already reaching for her car keys. Eleanor Morris. She's nearly 90, I protested. And she's never been willing to talk about what happened. What makes you think she'll talk now? Linda carefully placed the photograph in an envelope. Because I have proof her husband was connected to Bernard Wallace right before the disappearance, despite Irene's objections. Linda was resolute. After Irene left, promising to check on her later, Linda drove to the Silver Pines retirement community, where Elena Morris had lived since her husband's disappearance. The facility was quiet. As Linda made her way to Elena's room, a nurse stopped her in the hallway. Mrs. Morris doesn't receive many visitors, the young woman said. She's been quite withdrawn lately. I'm an old acquaintance, Linda replied. It's important. The nurse hesitated before nodding. Just 10 minutes. She tires easily. Elena Morris sat by the window, her thin frame diminished further by age, staring out at the landscaped grounds. She didn't turn when Linda entered. Eleanor, Linda said softly. It's Linda Graham, Sophie's mother. The elderly woman's shoulders stiffened visibly. But she didn't turn around. I have nothing to say to you, Mrs. Graham. I've told you that for 49 years. Linda moved closer, determination fueling each step. I found something, Elena, a photograph from the science fair 2 days before the field trip. She placed the envelope on the table beside Eleanor, who still refused to look. Your husband is in this photo talking to Bernard Wallace, the same Bernard Wallace who owned the land where the children were going for their field trip, the same man who told investigators he had no connection to Westbrook Academy. Elena's hands trembled slightly. Please leave. Did Stanley tell you anything before the trip? Anything unusual about his conversation with Wallace? You've spent your life chasing ghosts, Mrs. Graham. Elena finally turned her eyes hard despite her frailty. It destroyed your marriage, alienated your friends. When will you accept that they're gone? Linda leaned forward, her voice low and intense. When I know what happened to them, when I know what happened to Sophie. Ellen's gaze flickered to the photograph. Then back to Linda. Bernard Wallace was a powerful man. He still is. You'd be wise to leave the past buried. So there was a connection. Linda pressed. Tell me what you know, Eleanor. After 49 years, don't the families deserve the truth? A shadow crossed Elena's face, something between fear and resignation. Stanley was worried about the trip. He said had insisted they use a specific bus route, one that would take them past his company's new development. Why would Wallace care about the bus route? Elena shook her head. I don't know. Stanley wouldn't say more the night before the trip. He was on the phone for hours. When I asked who he was talking to, he said it was better if I didn't know. The nurse appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Morris needs to rest now. Linda reached for Elena's hand, grasping it gently. Please, if there's anything else you remember, my husband vanished too, Mrs. Graham. Elena said, her voice suddenly stronger. Whatever happened that day took him as well. But some questions are dangerous to answer even after all these years. As Linda drove home, her mind raced with possibilities. The connection to Wallace Industries was the first real lead she'd had in decades. She thought of Martin, how he begged her to find peace, to accept the tragedy and move forward. But now, with this new evidence, she felt closer to the truth than ever before. Back home, Linda spread her research materials across the dining room table. News clippings, police reports, maps, and now the photograph. Bailey curled at her feet as she worked, connecting threads that had remained elusive for nearly half a century. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Linda, it's Irene. Are you all right? What did Elena say? She confirmed it. Irene Wallace had some interest in the school trip. He specifically requested they take a certain route. Irene's sigh was audible through the receiver. Linda, please be careful. Wallace Industries still practically owns this town. Bernard's son runs it now, but the family is just as powerful as they've always been. I'm going to the police tomorrow, Linda said firmly. This photograph changes everything. The police have heard your theories for decades. What makes you think they'll listen now? Linda stared at the photograph, at the worried expression on Principal Morris's face as he spoke with Bernard Wallace. Because this time I have proof that someone lied. After hanging up, Linda continued working well into the night. As she was about to give up and go to bed, her eyes caught another detail in the photograph she'd missed earlier. In the far background, barely visible, was a truck with the Wallace Industries logo and Stenkel on its side were the words chemical transport. What were you transporting near a school field trip, Mr. Wallace? Linda whispered to the empty room. And what happened when something went wrong? She felt a chill run down her spine, the pieces finally beginning to form a cohesive picture. After 49 years, Linda Graham was closer than ever to uncovering the truth about what happened to her daughter Sophie and the other 72 students and 8 staff members of Westbrook Academy, who vanished without a trace on that spring day in 1976. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Morning lights streamed through the blinds as Linda organized her evidence. She barely slept. The photograph of Bernard Wallace speaking with Principal Morris keeping her mind racing all night. Bailey watched from her bed in the corner, sensing her owner's determination. Linda carefully placed the photo and her notes in a folder along with newspaper clippings about Wallace Industries. From 1976, the company had been expanding rapidly, then buying land throughout the county, land that included the nature preserve where the children were heading on their field trip. The Pinehaven Police Department hadn't changed much over the decades. The same faded brick building, the same American flag hanging limply on days without wind. Linda had walked through these doors countless times over the years, each visit ending in disappointment. The desk sergeant, a young man Linda didn't recognize, looked up as she approached. Can I help you, ma'am? I need to speak with someone about the Westbrook Academy case. The sergeant's expression shifted from polite interest to thinly veiled annoyance. The cold case from the 70s. I'm not sure anyone's available for that today. It's important. I found new evidence, he sighed. Take a seat. I'll see if Detective Hartman is in. Linda sat in a hard plastic chair, Clutching her folder, photos of officers lined the wall, including several who had worked the original investigation. Most were retired now, some had passed away, taking their knowledge of the case with them. After 20 minutes, a different officer appeared, younger, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair and attentive eyes. Mrs. Graham, I'm Officer Mark Williams. Detective Hartman is unavailable, but I'd be happy to speak with you. Linda followed him to a small interview room, the same one where she'd sat numerous times before. I understand you have information about the Westbrook Academy disappearance. Officer Williams said, his tone professional but kind. Yes, I found this photograph yesterday. Linda slid it across the table. It was taken 2 days before the disappearance at the school's science fair. Williams studied the image. And what am I looking for here? The man speaking with Principal Morris. In the background, that's Bernard Wallace. Williams raised an eyebrow. Wallace, as in Wallace Industries? Yes, the official investigation concluded that Wallace had no connection to Westbrook Academy, despite his company owning the land where the children were headed for their field trip. Williams examined the photo more closely. This could be anyone, Mrs. Graham. The image isn't very clear. I spoke with Elena Morris last night. She confirmed that her husband was speaking with Wallace. She said Wallace had insisted on a specific bus route for the field trip, one that would take them past his company's new development. This caught Williams's attention. Eleanor Morris actually told you this after refusing to speak about the case for decades. Linda nodded. She also mentioned that Principal Morris was worried the night before the trip. He was on the phone for hours. Williams leaned back. Considering Mrs. Graham, I appreciate your dedication, but this isn't exactly smoking gun evidence. There's more. Linda pointed to the background of the photo. See that truck? It's a Wallace Industries chemical transport vehicle. What was it doing near a school? With Williams studied the image again, his expression shifting. I can't confirm what that is from this photo alone. Then help me investigate. Linda insisted. Wallace Industries was developing that land in '76. What if they were using chemicals they shouldn't have been? What if the school bus drove through something they weren't supposed to see? The officer sighed, running a hand through his hair. Mrs. Graham, Linda, please. Linda, I understand this case means everything to you, but we can't launch an investigation based on a blurry photo and the recollections of an elderly woman about a conversation from nearly 50 years ago. Linda felt the familiar frustration rising. Then what about this? She pulled out several newspaper clippings. Wallace Industries was cited multiple times in the mid-70s for environmental violations. The citations mysteriously disappeared from public record within months. This piqued Williams' interest. How do you know they existed if they disappeared from the record? Because I kept copies, Linda said triumphantly. My husband was a lawyer. He requested these documents during our initial investigation before Wallace's lawyers blocked access. Williams took the papers, scanning them with growing interest. These are serious violations: improper disposal of chemical waste, contamination of groundwater, all near the property where the children were headed. Linda added, what if they saw something they weren't supposed to see, or were exposed to something? Williams was silent for a long moment, his professionalism wearing with his curiosity. Finally, he closed the folder. This happened before I was born. Most of the officers who work the case are retired or gone. I don't have the authority to reopen such an investigation without substantial evidence. Linda's hope began to fade, the familiar disappointment settling in her chest. But Williams continued, I can look into these environmental violations unofficially if there's a connection to Wallace Industries that was overlooked. He trailed off, then reached for a business card. Here's my direct number. If you find anything else, call me. Not the station, not Detective Hartman. Linda took the card, a small flame of hope rekindling. Thank you, Officer Williams. Mark, he corrected, and Linda, be careful. Bernard Wallace is still one of the most powerful men in the state, even in his 80s. If you start asking questions, I've been asking questions for 49 years. Linda replied, steel in her voice. I'm not afraid of Bernard Wallace or his family. After leaving the police station, Linda drove to the Pinehaven Town Archives. She needed more information about Wallace Industries operations in 1976. The archives were housed in the basement of the public library, a cool, quiet space smelling of old paper and dust. Mrs. Patel, the elderly archivist, greeted Linda with a warm smile. "Linda Graham, I haven't seen you in years. How can I help you today?" "I'm researching Wallace Industries, specifically their activities in 1976 around the time of the Westbrook disappearance." Mrs. Patel's smile faded slightly, still searching for answers after all this time. "Always," Linda replied simply. Patel led her to a row of filing cabinets. "Newspaper archives are here. Town council minutes are in those boxes. Business records would be on microfilm." She hesitated. "But you won't find much on Wallace Industries. Most of their records were sealed after that business with the water contamination lawsuit in '82. Water contamination. This was new information to Linda. "Oh yes. Several families claimed their well water had been contaminated by chemicals from Wallace's manufacturing plant. The case was settled out of court. All records sealed." Mrs. Patel lowered her voice. "My husband worked at the plant back then. He said they were ordered to dispose of chemicals in the middle of the night directly into Pinecrest River." Linda's heart raced. "Pinecrest River runs directly through the nature preserve where the children were going." Mrs. Patel nodded gravely. "Many thought there was a connection to the school disappearance, but no one could prove anything. Wallace's lawyers threatened anyone who suggested it." For the next 2 hours, Linda pored over newspaper archives, finding small mentions of land disputes between local farmers and Wallace Industries. In early 1976, one article caught her eye: a protest by environmental activists 2 weeks before the field trip, concerned about wildlife dying near Wallace's new development. As Linda was about to leave, Mrs. Patel approached with a thin file folder. "I forgot we had this," she said quietly. "It's a personal collection donated by Jacob Morrow, a reporter who covered the Westbrook story. He died last year, and his daughter brought in his papers." Linda opened the file with trembling hands. Inside were handwritten notes, interviewed transcripts, and photographs, including one showing Bernard Wallace arguing with a man Linda didn't recognize at the edge of the nature preserve, dated just 1 week before the disappearance. "Can I make copies of these?" Mrs. Patel nodded, glancing nervously toward the stairs. Quickly, the library closes in 20 minutes. Outside, the afternoon sun was sinking behind the hills as Linda carefully placed the copied documents in her car. As she opened her door, a sleek black sedan pulled up beside her, the window lowered to reveal the middle-aged man in an expensive suit. "James Wallace, Bernard, and current CEO of Wallace Industries, Mrs. Graham," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "I understand you've been asking questions about my father and his company." Linda straightened, gripping her car keys tightly. "News travels fast in Pinehaven. It's a small town," James replied with a thin smile. "My father is an old man now, nearly 90. These accusations you're dredging up are causing him distress." "I haven't made any accusations, Mr. Wallace. I'm just looking for the truth about what happened to my daughter." His smile never wavered. "The truth is that a terrible accident occurred 49 years ago. A bus crashed in a remote location that was never found. It was a tragedy, but continuing to suggest my family had something to do with it is problematic." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. "If your family had nothing to do with it, then you have nothing to worry about," Linda replied evenly. James Wallace's eyes hardened. "My father built this town, Mrs. Graham. Our company employs half the county. Even now, we contribute millions to local infrastructure, schools, the police department." He let the implication hang in the air. "Let the past stay buried for everyone's sake." Before Linda could respond, the window rolled up, and the sedan pulled away smoothly, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot, heart pounding. That evening, Linda spread her findings across her dining room table. The copies from Jacob Morrow file revealed a reporter who had suspected a connection between Wallace Industries and the disappearance, but had been unable to prove it. In one particularly interesting note, Morrow had written, "Source at Wallace plant claims chemical spill day before field trip. BW ordered cleanup before anyone noticed. Route change to avoid exposure." Linda's phone rang, startling her. It was Mark Williams. "I looked into those environmental violations," he said without preamble. "They were real, but the records were officially expunged following a court order in 1977. Someone went to great lengths to bury them. James Wallace confronted me today." Linda replied, "He warned me to stop asking questions." A pause. "That's concerning. They're watching you already, I found." Something else. Notes from a reporter suggesting there was a chemical spill the day before the field trip. Wallace ordered a cleanup and changed the bus route. "Do you have any proof?" Just the reporter's notes. "He's dead now, but his daughter might know more." Her name is Linda. Check the file. Catherine Morrow. "She's a doctor at Pinehaven Memorial. I'll see what I can find out about her," Mark promised. "In the meantime, be careful. If Wallace Industries is behind this, they've managed to keep it quiet for nearly 5 decades. They won't take kindly to someone digging it up now." After hanging up, Linda fixed herself a simple dinner, her mind working through the information she gathered. The chemical transport truck in the photo, the environmental violations, the report's notes about a spill. It was all starting to form a pattern. Bailey whined at the back door, needing to go out. Linda let her into the fenced yard, watching as the old dog slowly made her way across the grass. The night was quiet, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The sound of tires on gravel broke the silence. Linda tensed as headlights swept across the yard, then relaxed as she recognized Irene's car. "I've been calling you all afternoon," Irene said as she approached, concern etched on her face. "Your line was busy." "I've been researching," Linda explained, letting Irene and I took the photo to the police, then spent hours at the archives. Irene took in the papers spread across the dining table. "Oh, Linda, it's all connected." Irene. "Wallace Industries, chemical spills, the change bus route. They've been covering something up for decades." Irene picked up one of the photocopy articles. "What do you think happened?" "I think the children were exposed to something, chemicals that Wallace Industries was illegally dumping. Something went wrong, and they've been hiding it ever since." "But where are the bodies? Where's the bus?" Irene's voice caught. "Where's David and Sophie?" Linda had no answer for that, the same question that had haunted her for 49 years. "James Wallace warned me today to stop investigating," she said. "Instead, he as much as threatened me." Irene's eyes widened. "Linda, be careful. These are powerful people. I'm close to something." "Irene, I can feel it." Linda pointed to the reporter's notes. "This man, Jacob Morrow, was investigating the same connections back in '76. I need to speak with his daughter, Catherine Morrow. I know her. She treated Howard after his heart attack last year." Irene hesitated. "But Linda, if Wallace Industries is involved, if they've been covering this up for decades, then they've gotten away with it for too long." Linda finished firmly. "Whatever happened to our children, they deserve justice. Even after all this time." As Irene was leaving, she paused at the door. "How Howard mentioned something strange the other day. His cousin worked for the state environmental agency in the '70s. He said there was a federal order to redirect funds meant for water testing in Pinehaven around the time of the disappearance. The paperwork authorizing it came from a senator who later joined Wallace Industries' board of directors." Linda's mind raced with the implications. So the government was involved in the cover-up too. It was a different time. Linda, environmental regulations were still new. Companies like Wallace had enormous influence. After Irene left, Linda couldn't sleep. She sat in her darkened living room, Bailey's head on her lap, thinking about what she'd learned. James Wallace's warning echoed in her mind, along with Elena Morris's words. "Some questions are dangerous to answer even after all these years." Just before midnight, her phone rang again. "Linda, it's Mark Williams. I found something about Catherine Morrow. She doesn't just work at Pinehaven Memorial. She specializes in treating long-term effects of chemical exposure, and her clinic receives substantial funding from a foundation connected to Wallace Industries." "Hush money," Linda suggested. Maybe she's been helping victims all along right under their noses." There was excitement in Mark's voice. "Now I think we need to talk to Dr. Morrow as soon as possible." Linda agreed, a plan already forming in her mind. "Tomorrow morning, I'll meet you at the hospital." As she finally went to bed, Linda felt closer to the truth than ever before. Whatever had happened to the 73 students and 8 staff members of Westbrook Academy, she was now certain of one thing: it hadn't been an accident. It had been a deliberate cover-up that reached from Wallace Industries all the way to the federal government. And after 49 years, someone was finally going to be held accountable. Pinehaven Memorial Hospital stood on the eastern edge of town, its mod glass exterior at odds with the small town surroundings. Linda arrived early, parking her car in the visitor's lot and checking the time. Mark Williams had texted that he would meet her at 99, giving them 15 minutes before Dr. Catherine Morrow's first appointment. The morning air felt unusually heavy. Promising rain later, Linda zipped her jacket and walked toward the entrance, her mind replaying her discoveries from the previous day. After decades of futile searching, pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, revealing a picture more disturbing than she had imagined. Mark was waiting in the lobby dressed in civilian clothes rather than his uniform. His casual attire couldn't hide his alertness as he scanned the area, nodding when he spotted Linda. "I didn't tell anyone at the department about this meeting," he said quietly as they walked toward the elevators. "After what you said about James Wallace's warning, I thought discretion might be best." "Thank you," Linda replied, relieved. "Did you learn anything else about Dr. Merrow?" "She's well-respected, specializes in treating chronic conditions resulting from environmental exposure. She founded a clinic here 10 years ago that primarily treats patients with unusual respiratory and neurological symptoms." The elevator doors opened onto the 5th floor, where a sign indicated the direction to the Morrow Environmental Health Clinic. As they approached the reception desk, a tall woman with graying brown hair emerged from an office, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Linda. "Mrs. Graham," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Catherine Morrow. I've been expecting you." Linda was taken aback. "You have?" Dr. Morrow's smile was sad, but knowing my father spoke of you often, he admired your persistence. She gestured toward her office. "Please come in, both of you." The office was warm and inviting, with plants on the windowsill and framed medical degrees on the wall. Dr. Merrow closed the door behind them and indicated for them to sit. "Officer Williams called this morning," she explained. "When he mentioned you were looking into my father's research, I rearranged my schedule." Linda leaned forward. "Your father believed there was a connection between Wallace Industries and the Westbrook Academy disappearance, didn't he?" Dr. Morrow nodded, her expression grave. "He spent years investigating it, long after his editors forced him to drop the story. Wallace Industries threatened to sue the newspaper, and suddenly my father was reassigned to cover local sports. But he kept investigating privately," Linda said, thinking of the notes she'd found. "Yes, it became his obsession." Dr. Merrow opened a drawer and removed a worn leather journal. "He left this for me when he died. I think you should see it." Linda accepted the journal with trembling hands. Inside were detailed notes, far more comprehensive than the file from the archives. Jacob Morrow had meticulously documented his investigation, including interviews with former Wallace employees, environmental samples taken from the nature preserve, and correspondence with government officials who had stonewalled him. "My father believed that Wallace Industries was illegally dumping toxic chemicals in remote areas of the nature preserve." Dr. Morrow explained he found evidence of unusually high levels of industrial solvents and compounds used in manufacturing processes that were largely unregulated in the 1970s. Mark leaned forward, and he connected this to the Westbrook disappearance. He believed the school bus took an unplanned detour through an area where a major spill had occurred the previous night. According to his sources, workers had been frantically cleaning up when the bus appeared unexpectedly. Linda's heart pounded as she turned the pages, finding a hand-drawn map with the suspected dump site marked. Did he ever find proof of what happened to the children and teachers? Dr. Merrow hesitated. "Not concrete proof, no, but he was convinced they had been exposed to something deadly, something Wallace Industries couldn't afford to have discovered." "But where are they?" Linda whispered, the eternal question that had haunted her for decades. "Where's the bus? Where are the bodies?" Dr. Morrow stood. "I can't answer that, but I can show you something that might help explain what my father discovered and why I founded this clinic." She led them through a secured door into a long corridor lined with examination rooms. Through windows in the doors, Linda could see patients of varying ages, many with oxygen tanks or mobility aids. These patients suffer from conditions consistent with exposure to the specific chemicals Wallace Industries was using in the 1970s. Dr. Morrow explained quietly: neurological damage, respiratory distress, immune disorders, rare cancers. Many of them lived near the areas my father identified as dump sites. All these people were affected?" Mark asked, visibly disturbed by the number of patients. "These represent only a fraction. Many died before the connection could be made. Others moved away seeking treatment elsewhere." Dr. Merrow paused outside one room, where an elderly man sat with an oxygen mask. "Mr. Jenkins worked at Wallace Industries from 1965 to 1980. He was part of the overnight cleanup crew the day before the Westbrook disappearance. Linda pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the implications. Has he spoken about what happened? He has severe cognitive impairment now, but years ago, he told my father about a school bus incident. He was too afraid to provide details, fearing for his family's safety. Wallace Industries paid for his medical care, with the condition that he sign a non-disclosure agreement. They continued walking, passing more rooms, with more patients, each representing a piece of the larger pattern of environmental devastation that Wallace Industries had tried to conceal after medical school. I returned to Pinehaven to continue my father's work in a different way. Tomorrow explained I couldn't prove what happened to those children, but I could help the victims who survived. Back in her office, Morrow opened a safe hidden behind a painting and removed a folder stamped classified in F-Ed red ink. My father obtained this from a government whistleblower in 1982. It's an environmental impact assessment that was suppressed by federal officials after pressure from Wallace Industries. The report detailed alarming levels of contamination in soil and water samples taken from the nature preserve in 1977, a year after the disappearance. More disturbing were the handwritten notes in the margins questioning whether the area should be designated a human health disaster zone, requiring evacuation and containment. There's more. Morrow said, her voice dropping. 3 years ago, a patient came to me, an elderly woman with symptoms matching those of chronic chemical exposure during treatment. She mentioned that her grandson would have attended Westbrook Academy, but she had moved her family away just weeks before the incident after her husband, who worked for Wallace, warned her something bad was coming. Linda's eyes widened. Did she know details? Only rumors, she said. Several employees were suddenly transferred to a Wallace facility in Arizona immediately after the disappearance, and that a specialized medical unit was established at a private location, funded through shell companies connected to Wallace Industries. Mark looked up sharply. A medical unit for survivors. Morrow nodded. That's my theory. If the children and staff were exposed to these chemicals, they would have needed immediate medical attention that couldn't be provided at a public hospital without raising questions. So some of them might have survived. Linda whispered, hope and horror mingling in her voice. They might have been kept somewhere, treated in secret. It's possible, Morrow admitted, but they would have suffered severe effect. The chemicals Wallace was using caused progressive damage to multiple organs. Without proper treatment, many would have died within weeks or months. And with proper treatment, Linda pressed, they might have survived. But with chronic health issues that would require ongoing care and monitoring. Linda's mind raced, piecing together the horrifying truth. Wallace Industries didn't just cover up an environmental disaster, they covered up what happened to those children. My Sophie, Irene's, David, all of them. My father believed the company couldn't risk the liability. Morrow confirmed grimly the lawsuits would have bankrupted them, and the criminal charges for the environmental violations alone could have sent executives to prison. So they made everyone disappear. Mark concluded, disgust evident in his voice. The ultimate cover-up. Morrow nodded solemnly. There's one more thing you should know. My clinic receives anonymous donations through a foundation called New Horizons Charitable Trust. I've traced its funding back to subsidiary companies owned by Wallace Industries. Guilt money, Linda said bitterly. Perhaps, or insurance keeping me focused on treating patients rather than asking too many questions about where they came from. Morrow handed Linda her father's journal. Take this. My father would have wanted you to have it. There are names inside, people who might know more before they left. Mark asked the question that had been bothering him. Morrow, why are you helping us? You must know how dangerous this could be for you. Catherine Morrow's expression hardened. Because I took an oath to do no harm. What happened to those children and what's still happening to people in this town is wrong. My father died still searching for the truth. I don't want the same for Mrs. Graham. Back in the hospital parking lot, rain had begun to fall, pattering against the hood of Linda's car as she and Mark discussed what they'd learned. This is bigger than I imagined, Mark admitted, running a hand through his hair. We're talking about corporate crime, environmental disaster, possible kidnapping, and a government cover-up spanning decades. And somewhere, Linda added, her voice tight with emotion, somewhere there might be survivors, people who know what happened to Sophie. Mark's phone buzzed. He checked it, frowning. I need to get back to the station. But first, there's something I should tell you. I did some digging into Wallace Industries financial records last night, the public ones anyway, in late 1976 and throughout 1977. They made a series of payments to a called Evergreen Medical Solutions, the private medical facility tomorrow, mentioned possibly Evergreen dissolved in 1985. But before that, they purchased a former sanatorium in Riverdale, about 40 meters from here. The property is now abandoned, but satellite images show it was operational until the mid-1980s. Linda's pulse quickened. We need to see that facility. I'll try to get access legally, but it might take time. In the meantime, focus on the names in Merrow's journal. Someone must know something concrete. After Mark left, Linda sat in her car, the rain growing heavier as she paged through Jacob Morrow's journal. One name appeared repeatedly: Richard Dalton, a former EPA official who had inexplicably resigned shortly after the Westbrook disappearance. According to Merrow's notes, Dalton had purchased an expensive house in cash. Just months later, Linda started her car determination, replacing the emotional turmoil she'd felt in Morrow's office. Richard Dalton still lived in Pinehaven, in the wealthy neighborhood on the north side of town. The rain was torrential by the time Linda reached Dalton's address, a large colonial-style house set back from the road. She parked and hurried to the covered porch, ringing the bell. Before she could reconsider, the door was opened by a thin man in his 80s. His once imposing frame now stooped with age. His eyes narrowed when Linda introduced herself. "I have nothing to say to you, Mrs. Graham," he said curtly, attempting to close the door. Linda blocked it with her foot. "I know about the payments, Mr. Dalton, the house you bought after resigning from the EPA. I know you helped cover up what Wallace Industries did." Dalton's face paled. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know there were survivors," Linda pressed, "children who needed medical care after being exposed to chemicals. That your agency should have regulated children like my daughter Sophie. Leave now, or I'll call the police." "Go ahead," Linda challenged. "I'm sure they'd be interested in the documents I have." Jacob Morrow's complete investigation, the suppressed environmental report records of payments from Wallace Industries. Dalton hesitated, glancing past her to the empty street. Finally, he stepped back. "5 minutes, then you leave, and never come back inside." Dalton led her to a study lined with books and framed credentials. He closed the door and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of resignation and fear. "What do you want from me? I'm an old man now. The truth, what happened to the children from Westbrook Academy?" Dalton sank into a leather chair, suddenly looking every one of his 80-plus years. It was a different time, Mrs. Graham. Environmental regulations were in their infancy. Companies like Wallace operated with virtual impunity. "That doesn't answer my question," he sighed heavily. "There was a spill, a major one, chemicals that never should have been there in the first place. The cleanup was rushed and incomplete. When the school bus took a wrong turn," he trailed off, shaking his head. "They were exposed." Linda finished, her voice barely audible. "Yes. The driver died almost immediately. The children and teachers, many were severely affected. Wallace's people arrived and took control of the scene before local authorities could respond." "And then what?" Linda demanded, her heart pounding. "They were transported to a private facility. Those who survived the initial exposure needed specialized treatment. Wallace couldn't risk taking them to a public hospital." "How many survived?" Linda asked, dreading the answer. Dalton looked away. "Initially, most of them, but the damage was extensive, progressive. I don't know how many survived long term. That information was compartmentalized, and no one said anything. Parents weren't told. Wallace Industries had too much power, too many connections in government. They convinced everyone that revealing the truth would only cause more pain." Dalton's voice hardened. "And they paid handsomely for cooperation." Linda felt sick. "You took blood money to hide what happened to our children." "I did what I was told," Dalton snapped, "and I've regretted it every day since." He stood, suddenly moving to a bookshelf and removing a small box. "I kept this. I don't know why, perhaps as insurance, or perhaps out of guilt." Inside the box was a key card with the Evergreen Medical Solutions logo and a photograph showing a group of children in hospital beds. The image was grainy and distant, but Linda's heart stopped as she recognized the profile of a young girl with auburn hair. "Sophie," she whispered, touching the image with trembling fingers. "I can't tell you if she survived long term," Dalton said quietly. "I was only involved in the initial cover-up. but there were survivors who eventually recovered enough to be relocated, given new identities, new lives. Where Linda demanded, "Where did they go? I don't know." Specific. A sharp crack interrupted him as something struck the window, spider webbing the glass. Dalton dropped to the floor, pulling Linda down with surprising strength. "They're watching. They must know you're here." Linda's phone rang. It was Mark. "Linda, where are you? Someone just called in a threat against you at the station." "I'm at Richard Dalton's house," she replied, her voice shaking. "Someone just shot at the window. Stay down. I'm sending patrol cars now." Mark's voice was urgent. "Linda, I found something. Records of patients transferred from Evergreen Medical to facilities across the country in 1977. One of the matches Sophie description and age." Linda clutched the phone tighter. Where did they send her?" "A long-term care facility in Arizona. The record shows she was there until 1982, then transferred to a group home under the name Sarah Phillips." There was a pause. "Linda, there's a current address in Riverdale. A woman named Sarah Phillips still lives there." The sound of sirens filled the air as police cars approached Dalton's house, but Linda barely heard them, her mind fixed on a single impossible thought. After 49 years, she might finally have found her daughter. The drive to Riverdale felt both endless and too short. Linda sat in the passenger seat of Mark's personal vehicle, clutching a folder containing the photograph from Dalton's house and the address Mark had found. Rain pelted the windshield as they left Pinehaven behind, following the winding highway through dense pine forests. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Mark asked, glancing at Linda as she stared out the window. "If this woman is Sophie, she's not the 12-year-old girl you remember. She's 61 now, and according to the medical records, she suffered significant trauma. I've been waiting 49 years. Linda replied, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "I'm ready for anything, as long as it's the truth." In truth, Linda wasn't sure what to expect. The photograph from Dalton showed a child in a hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding her. If Sophie had survived, what kind of life had she lived? What had been done to her? The questions haunted Linda with each passing mile. Their arrival in Riverdale offered few answers. Unlike Pinehaven, which had remained largely unchanged over the decades, Riverdale had expanded into a small city with shopping centers and housing developments spreading outward from its historic downtown. The address Mark had found was on the outskirts of town, a modest residential area called Evergreen Estates. As they approached, Linda noticed something odd about the neighborhood. Unlike the open streets elsewhere in Riverdale, Evergreen Estates was gated with a security checkpoint at its entrance. "That's unusual for a middle-class neighborhood," Mark observed, slowing the car. "Private security, too, not just a gate code." A uniformed guard approached as they stopped at the checkpoint. "Good afternoon. Can I help you?" Mark showed his police ID. "Officer Mark Williams, Pinehaven PD. This is Linda Graham. We're here to visit a resident, Sarah Phillips." The guard's expression shifted subtly, his eyes flickering to Linda. "May I ask the purpose of your visit?" "Personal matter," Mark replied smoothly. The guard stepped away, speaking quietly into a radio. After a moment, he returned. "I'm sorry, but Miss Phillips isn't receiving visitors today." Linda leaned across Mark. "Please, it's extremely important. I believe Sarah might be my daughter." The guard's professional demeanor faltered. "Your music daughter? She was one of the children who disappeared from Westbrook Academy in 1976. We have reason to believe she survived and was brought here under a new identity." The guard studied Linda's face for a long moment, then stepped away again, speaking more urgently into his radio. When he returned, his manner had changed. "Please wait here. Someone will be down to escort you." 10 minutes later, a man in his 40s approached on foot. He wore casual clothes, but his alert bearing suggested a background in security or law enforcement. "Mrs. Graham, I'm Jeremy Phillips. I understand you're looking for Sarah." Linda stepped out of the car, heart pounding. "Yes. Are you related to her?" "I'm her caretaker." In a manner of speaking, he studied Linda intently. "May I ask what led you here after all this time?" Mark joined them, showing his ID again. "We've uncovered evidence of a cover-up involving the Westbrook Academy disappearance. Medical records indicate that a girl matching Sophie Graham's description was treated under the name Sarah Phillips and eventually relocated here." Jeremy's posture tensed. "I see. And what do you intend to do with this information?" "I just want to see her," Linda said simply, "to know if she's really my daughter." "Please." Jeremy hesitated, then nodded. "Follow me." But I should warn you, Sarah's health is fragile. She has good days and bad days today. Is somewhere in between. They followed Jeremy through the neighborhood, which Linda now noticed was designed with accessibility in mind. Wide sidewalks, ramps alongside steps, and homes with single-level living spaces. Several residents watched from windows or porches as they passed, their expressions wary. This entire community, Mark began connecting the dots. Are they all survivors? And their families? Jeremy confirmed quietly, not all from Westbrook. Some were exposed to Wallace chemicals and other incidents. The company established this community to provide specialized care while keeping everyone isolated from unwanted attention. How many survived from Westbrook? Linda asked, dreading the answer. Initially, about 30 students and 3 staff members. Long-term, fewer. Jeremy's voice was heavy with old sorrow. I was one of them. I was 10 when it happened. Linda stopped in her tracks. You were there on the bus. Jeremy nodded unconsciously, rubbing his left arm, which he'll now noticed was significantly weaker than his right. I don't remember much from that day. Just the bus stopping, people coughing, and then waking up in a hospital. We weren't told what happened until years later, when we were deemed stable enough to handle the truth. They approached a blue craftsman-style house with a wraparound porch, flower boxes bloomed with carefully tended marigolds and petunias, and wind chimes tinkled softly in the light breeze that had followed the rain. This is Sarah's house, Jeremy said, pausing at the gate. She lives alone, but has daily assistance. She's expecting you now. He turned to Linda, his expression solemn. Whatever happens in there, please understand that Sarah has built a life here, a good life. Despite everything, don't take that away from her. Linda nodded, suddenly unable to speak as the reality of the moment overwhelmed her. After decades of seeing, of hoping against hope, she was about to discover if her daughter had been alive all this time. Just 40 mil away, Jeremy led them up the path to the front door, which opened before they reached it. A slender woman stood in the doorway, her auburn hair stray with gray, her posture slightly stooped. She leaned on a cane, but her gaze was steady as it fixed on Linda. Time seemed to stop as Linda took in every detail of the woman's face, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her cheekbones, the small scar near her right eyebrow from a childhood fall, all achingly familiar despite the passage of decades. Sophie, Linda whispered, her voice breaking. The woman's free hand clutched the doorframe. Nobody's called me that in a very long time, she replied softly. They told us our families thought we were dead, that it was better that way. Linda took a step forward, then stopped, afraid to move too quickly. I never believed you were gone. Not completely. I kept searching. I know, Sarah, Sophie said with a sad smile. Jeremy told me he's been monitoring your activities for years, keeping me updated. She gestured toward the interior of the house. Please come in. We have a lot to talk about. The inside of the house was neat and comfortable, adapted for someone with mobility challenges. Sophie leaded them to a sunlit living room, where photographs lined the walls, landscapes, nature scenes, but notably no people. I'm sorry, there's nowhere more comfortable to sit, Sophie said, lowering herself carefully into a recliner. My back doesn't tolerate regular furniture well anymore. Linda sat across from her, unable to take her eyes off the woman who had once been her little girl. The resemblance was unmistakable now. Sophie had marked Martin's eyes and jawline, but the rest was purely Linda. You look like him, Sophie said unexpectedly. My father. I still remember his face. He never forgot yours, Linda replied, tears welling in her eyes. He kept your picture by his bed until the day he died, when 3 months ago, heart failure. Sophie nodded, slowly absorbing this information. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. Jeremy cleared his throat. I should give you privacy, Officer Williams. Perhaps you'd like to see the community center. It contains records that might interest you. Mark glanced at Linda, who nodded her approval. After they left, the room fell silent save for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. I don't know where to begin, Linda admitted. I have so many questions. Sophie's smile was tinged with sadness. I don't remember everything. The chemicals affected my memory, especially of that day. But I'll tell you what I can. She described waking up in a Stark medical facility, confused and in pain. The doctors rarely spoke to the children directly, treating them more like subjects than patients. Some children disappeared from the ward, never to return. Others, like Sophie, slowly stabilized. They told us a story about a chemical leak at a factory near where our bus had stopped. Sophie explained, said our families had been told we died in the accident because the company couldn't risk lawsuits, but that was a lie. Linda said, anger seeping into her voice. We were never told anything, they just made you disappear. Sophie nodded. I figured that out years later. By then we had been moved several times, given new identities. Some of us had such severe health problems that we needed constant care. Others, like Jeremy, could function more independently. Did you ever try to contact us to come home? Sophie's eyes clouded with old pain. Once when I was 16, I saved my allowance and tried to run away to find my way back to Pinehaven. The security team caught me at the bus station. After that, they moved us to a more secure facility, told us it was for our protection, that people would exploit us if they knew the truth. Linda leaned forward, desperate to bridge the decades of separation. What happened after that? How did you end up here in Riverdale? In my 20s, my condition worsened. The chemical exposure caused progressive neurological damage along with respiratory and immune system problems. Sophie gestured to the various medical devices discreetly positioned around the room. When Wallace Industries established this community in the 1990s, those of us who remained were relocated here. They provide medical care, housing, even jobs for those who can work. Keeping you isolated, Linda observed bitterly, controlling the narrative, yes, but also keeping us alive. Sophie counted the medical care we need as specialized and expensive. Few of us could afford it otherwise. A silence fell between and them, filled with the weight of 49 years of separation of lives, forever altered by corporate greed and government complicity. What about your life here? Linda asked finally. Are you happy? A complex series of emotions crossed Sophie's face. I've made peace with it. I have friends here, other survivors who understand. I teach art classes when my health permits. She gestured to several paintings on the walls that Linda now realized must be Sophie's work. It's not the life I would have chosen, but it's mine. The front door opened, and Jeremy returned with Mark, whose expression indicated he'd made significant discoveries. Linda, Mark said urgently. Jeremy's shown me documentation confirming everything: medical records, transfer orders, even internal Wallace Industries memos discussing the containment strategy for the survivals. It's all kept in a central archive. Jeremy explained, part of the agreement with Wallace Industries. We maintain records of what happened, but they remain sealed within the community. Until now, Sophie added, her voice stronger than before. I want the truth to come out, whatever the consequences. I've lived in the shadows long enough. Linda reached for her daughter's hand, overwhelmed by a mixture of joy at finding her alive and rage at what had been stolen from them. Both will tell your story, everyone's story, and Wallace Industries will finally answer for what they did. As they were preparing to leave, Sophie handed Linda a flash drive. Jeremy made copies of the most important documents: names, dates, the chain of command that approved the cover-up, everything you need to expose them. The drive back to Pinehaven was considerably different from the journey to Riverdale. Linda sat in stunned silence for much of it, processing the reality that Sophie was alive, but permanently damaged by the chemicals she'd been exposed to. Mark was on his phone, repeatedly speaking in low, urgent tones with contacts at the state police and FBI. This is too big for our department, he explained after one call. We need federal resources to take on Wallace Industries. They've put together a team that can be here by tomorrow. As they crested the hill overlooking Pinehaven, Linda was startled to see several news vans parked outside the police station. Words getting out, Mark said grimly. Someone must have talked. Reporters swarmed the car as they pulled up, shouting questions about missing children and industrial cover-up. Mark shielded Linda as they pushed through the crowd into the station, where Chief Patterson was waiting, his expression thunderous. Williams, what the hell is going on? I've got reporters claiming one of my officers is investigating Wallace Industries for kidnapping, and James Wallace called demanding an emergency meeting with the mayor. It's all true, Chief, Mark said firmly. We have evidence, survivors' testimony, internal documents. Wallace Industries orchestrated the disappearance of those children to cover up chemical exposure. They've been hiding survivors for decades. Before the chief could respond, the station door burst open, and James Wallace strode in, accompanied by two attorneys. This ends now, he announced, his voice cold. Officer Williams, you're to cease this unauthorized investigation immediately. Mrs. Graham, my attorneys will be contacting you regarding these slanderous accusations. Linda stood her ground, facing the man whose family had caused so much suffering. "I found my daughter, Mr. Wallace. I found Sophie. She's alive along with other survivors your company has been hiding for 49 years. Wallace's composure faltered momentarily. "You found that's impossible. Evergreen Estates in Riverdale." Linda continued, her voice steady. "A community your company built to house the survivors, while keeping them isolated and controlled. We have all the documentation, medical records, transfer orders, internal memos, everything." Chief, one of Wallace's attorneys, interjected. "These accusations are baseless. We demand they're not accusations anymore." Mark interrupted, inserting the flash drive into a computer. "Their evidence in a federal investigation." As documents began to appear on the screen, James Wallace's face drained of color. The photographs were unmistakable: children in hospital beds, intermemos discussing containment strategies and long-term management of affected subjects, financial records showing millions allocated to the Westbrook Continuity Project. "My father made difficult decisions during a different era," Wallace said finally, his voice hollow. "Environmental regulations were still evolving. The company would have been destroyed by the liability. 73 children and 8 adults." Linda replied, each word precise: "and cutting lives, destroyed families, shattered all to protect your company's bottom line." The room fell silent as the weight of the revelation settled over everyone present. Then Chief Patterson straightened his decision made. "James Wallace, I'm detaining you pending the arrival of federal authorities," he announced. "Officer Williams, secure these documents and contact the FBI." "Again, Mrs. Graham." He paused, his professional demeanor softening. "I'm truly sorry for what your family has endured." As Wallace was led away, still protesting, Linda turned to Mark. "I need to call Irene. She needs to know about David." Mark's expression fell. "Linda, Jeremy mentioned David Carter. He didn't survive the initial exposure." "I'm sorry." Linda closed her eyes, grief for her friend mixing with the tumultuous emotions of finding her own daughter alive. "She still deserves to know the truth." All the families do. Later that evening, as federal agents began arriving in Pinehaven and news of the discovery spread, Linda sat in her living room with Irene and Howard Bailey lay at her feet, sensing the gravity of the moment. As Linda shared everything she had learned, Jeremy provided a complete list of the children and staff who initially survived. She explained gently, "David was exposed to a higher concentration of chemicals. The doctors, they couldn't save him." Irene wept in her husband's arms, decades of uncertainty finally giving way to the painful clarity of truth. "At least now we know," she said between tears. "After all these years, we finally know." Linda's phone rang. Mark calling with an update. "The FBI has secured Evergreen Estates," he reported. "They're interviewing survivors and gathering evidence, and news crews from national networks are arriving." This story is breaking wide open. As Linda hung up, she felt a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow. The truth was finally emerging after nearly 5 decades of lies and cover-ups. But the cost had been unimaginably high: lives destroyed, families torn apart, justice delayed for generations. "What happens now?" Howard asked, still holding Irene. Linda looked at the photograph of Sophie she'd taken before leaving Riverdale, a woman in her 60s with Linda's features and Martin's eyes, standing on her porch with quiet dignity. Despite all she had endured now, Linda said firmly, "We bring our children home." Pinehaven transformed overnight. FBI agents in dark suits moved through the town, interviewing residents and securing documents. News vans lined Main Street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward as reporters delivered live updates against the backdrop of Wallace Industries headquarters. The story captivated the nation: an entire school vanishing, decades of deception, survivors hidden away, and a corporate giant's fall from grace. Linda sat at her dining room table, surrounded by photographs of the missing children. She had asked Mark to obtain them from police archives, images of 73 young faces, forever frozen in time. She recognized many Sophie's friends' children. She had watched grow alongside her daughter for 7 years before they vanished. Chaka doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Bailey barked once, then limped to the door, her age showing in her movements. Linda opened it to find several people standing on her porch, parents of the missing children, many of whom she hadn't seen in years. Some had moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss. Others had stayed but retreated into private grief. "We heard," said an elderly man Linda recognized as Michael Torres, whose son Juan had been Sophie's classmate, about the survivors. Is it true? Linda stepped back, inviting them in. Yes, some of them survived. They've been living in a controlled community in Riverdale. I've seen Sophie. The group moved into Linda's living room, filling every available seat. Some wept quietly, while others bombarded her with questions about their own children. I don't have all the answers yet, Linda explained, raising her hands. The FBI has secured the community and is interviewing everyone. They've promised to contact each family individually once they've confirmed identities. Why didn't they try to reach us? Asked Patricia Morrison, her voice breaking. All these years they were told we believed they were dead. Linda replied gently that it was better for everyone if they stayed away. Many have health issues from the chemical exposure. Some have memory problems, and they were constantly monitored, prevented from making outside contact. Prisoners, Michael said bitterly. For half a century. Mark arrived as they were talking, carrying files and looking exhausted. The FBI had deputized him as local liaison. Recognizing his role in breaking the case, I have preliminary information, he announced, setting his files on the coffee table. Of the 81 people on the bus, 33 survived the initial exposure, 22 survived long-term, though all with chronic medical conditions. The room fell silent as the numbers sank. In 59 people, mostly children, had died within days or weeks of the exposure. Another 11 had succumbed to complications in the following years. I've been authorized to share the list of confirmed survivors. Mark continued, his voice gentle. Each family will be contacted by agents today. But since you're all here, he withdrew a single sheet of paper and began reading names. With each name, a gasp or so broke the silence. Some families discovered their children had survived. Others received final confirmation of their deaths. Linda held the hand of Patricia Morrison, whose daughter's name wasn't among the survivors. As Mark finished reading, Linda noticed Irene and Howard standing in the doorway, their faces pale. They had arrived late, missing the reading of the list. Irene, Linda said, crossing to her friend. Mark has news for all the families. They've identified the survivors. Irene's grip on Howard's arm tightened, and David, our son. Mark glanced down at his list, his expression unreadable. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I need to speak with you privately. Linda felt a chill. David's name hadn't been on the list of survivors. Mark had read aloud. Were there complications? Details too painful to share in the group. As Mark led Irene and Howard to the kitchen, the remaining families continued discussing the revelations, planning a community meeting for all affected families. The following day at the town hall, Linda's attention was drawn to the television, where Bernard Wallace, the company's 89-year-old founder, was making his first public statement. The allegations regarding Westbrook Academy are deeply troubling, the elderly man read from a prepared statement, his voice quavering with age. While Wallace Industries has always prioritized community well-being, decisions made during my leadership in the 1970s were governed by different regulatory standards than exist today. He's setting up a legal defense, Mark said, returning from the kitchen, claiming they followed the laws of the time. Where are Irene and Howard? Linda asked, noting their absence. They left through the back door. There's something they need to see in Riverdale. Mark's expression softened. Something good, Linda, trust me. Before Linda could press for details, her phone rang. Sophie calling from Riverdale. The FBI is everywhere. Sophie reported, her voice a mixture of relief and anxiety. They're interviewing everyone, collecting medical records, taking photographs of the facility. Are you all right? Linda asked, moving into a quieter corner of the room. Yes, overwhelmed, but all right. They want me to testify before a grand jury next week about what I remember from the aftermath. I'm nervous. I'll be there with you, Linda promised every step of the way. After making arrangements to visit Sophie the following day, Linda returned to the group in her living room. The initial shock had given way to determination as the families organized themselves, appointing representatives to liaise with federal authorities and planning support systems for the returning survivors. When everyone had finally left, Mark remained behind to share additional information. The FBI found evidence of massive document destruction at Wallace Industries this morning, he said, lowering his voice. Despite the empty house, they arrived just as executives were shredding files. What they recovered suggests government involvement at the highest levels. We already knew the EPA was compromised, Linda replied, remembering her conversation with Richard Dalton. It goes higher. Cabinet-level officials signed off on the cover-up, classified it as a matter of national security. To prevent investigation, Mark ran a hand through his hair. His exhaustion evident. Wallace was manufacturing chemicals for military applications. The formula that spilled was experimental, not even properly tested for environmental impacts. Linda felt a surge of anger. They used our children as test subjects, afterward monitoring the effects, studying them like lab rats. The medical documentation confirms it. Devermaro is already providing expert testimony on the long-term effects. Mark checked his watch. I should go. The FBI wants me at another briefing. In an hour after Mark left, Linda sat alone in her living room, the weight of justice finally within reach. After decades of searching, she was preparing for bed when her phone rang again, Irene calling, her voice breathless with emotion. Linda, you need to come to Riverdale now. It's about Jeremy Phillips, Sophie's caretaker. What about him? He's, oh God, Linda, he's David, my David. He's alive. The revelation struck Linda like a physical blow. But Mark said the list didn't include Jeremy Phillips. Is an alias, Irene explained, her words tumbling out. He was so young when it happened. His memory was affected more severely than the others. He didn't remember his real name or family until years later, and by then he'd been told we'd moved on, that it would be cruel to reappear in our lives. I'm coming right now, Linda said, already reaching for her car keys. The drive to Riverdale passed in a blur. Linda replayed every interaction with Jeremy, searching for hints. She might have missed his age, matched the way he'd rubbed his left arm. Hadn't David broken that arm, falling from a tree the summer before the disappearance at Evergreen Estates? The security checkpoint was now staffed by FBI agents who verified her identity before allowing her through. Irene and Howard had provided an address, not Sophie's house, but another home several streets away. Linda approached the modest ranch-style house, its porch light illuminating Irene and Howard standing with Jeremy, with David between them. The family resemblance was striking now that Linda was looking for it. David had Howard's build and Irene's expressive eyes. Linda, Irene called, her face radiant, despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. Come meet my son. David stepped forward, extending his hand. I should have told you when we met. I'm sorry you knew who I was, who you were. He nodded. I've known my real identity since my 30s, when fragments of memory started returning during therapy. By then I'd been Jeremy Phillips longer than I'd been David Carter. I was afraid to disrupt lives that had moved on without me. But you kept watch over Sophie, Linda said, understanding dawning. You protected her all these years. She was the only connection to my past that felt real, David admitted. When I became head of community security 15 years ago, I gained access to all the files. I learned about you, how you never stopped searching, never accepted that Sophie was gone. Howard placed a hand on his son's shoulder, still seeming unable to believe the miracle before him. He thought we'd moved away, started new lives. The Wallace people told all the survivors that their families had scattered after the incident. More lies, Linda said bitterly, designed to keep you isolated, dependent on them. David nodded. They controlled everything: our medical care, our housing, our communication with the outside world. It was presented as protection, but it was really containment. A car pulled into the driveway, Sophie arriving in a specialized vehicle adapted for her medical needs. The driver, a health care worker, helped her into a wheelchair and brought her to the porch. I thought you were coming tomorrow, Sophie said, seeing Linda change of plans. Linda replied, gesturing toward David. Did you know? Sophie nodded slowly. Not until recently. David revealed his true identity to me last year, after his memory therapy progressed enough for him to be certain. We kept it secret, afraid of Wallace Industries' reaction. If they knew we were connecting the dots. The five of them moved inside, where photographs now covered the coffee table, images from before the disappearance, from the years of treatment, and from their lives in Evergreen Estates. The FBI found these in the community archives. David explained they documented everything: our medical treatments, our educational progress, even our psychological evaluations, all to study the long-term effects of the chemical exposure. Linda studied the photographs, tracing Sophie's transformation from a frightened child in a hospital bed to a teenager in a wheelchair to a young woman tentatively holding a paintbrush to the dignified older woman she was now. We're organizing a community meeting in Pinehaven tomorrow. Linda told them, all the families of the Westbrook children. Would you consider coming? Both of you? David and Sophie exchanged glances. The FBI wants us to remain here. until they've completed their investigation, David said, but they mentioned possibly arranging a supervised visit to Pinehaven next week. All the survivors together, returning to the town they were taken from. Sophie mused, her expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. I've dreamed of seeing Pinehaven again for decades. I wonder if I'll recognize anything. Some things haven't changed, Linda assured her. The town square, the old library, the park where you used to play Martin, and